All right, everybody, welcome back. We are doing our second episode of Rob Davis's book, Purpose in Form, Necessary Basis of All Ethics. And in today's episode, we're going to be delving into chapter one. Last week, we went in through the introduction, and this week, we're going to be going through chapter one, which is called The Myth of the Infinite, of the
Myth
Finite.
of Finite.
Sorry, Myth
Yeah.
of the Finite.
Yeah.
First off, how you doing, Rob?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Doing well, man. Doing well.
I'm
You're in
excited for this.
yeah, me too. Me too.
Hmm.
You're in Missouri, right? Missouri?
Missouri. Yeah.
Missouri. Yeah, I'm in Lowell. So
So
I
we're
know
closer than usual.
a little closer than usual. Okay. And I
Hmm.
guess outsiders would call it Louisville or Louisville, but I guess if you've been in the state for a while in the city, it just kind of comes out as Lowell,
Oh, yeah.
Lowell, you know. So
Good
yeah,
place. Great place.
it's a great place, great place, great weather today. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm ready to massage some minds and tickle some intellects here.
Yeah. Maybe break them too. We'll see.
Break 'em. Yeah, break them. I mean,
Yeah.
this is not a light discussion. I mean, we're gonna be, well, first off, let me as a disclaimer say that neither of us have taken any hallucinogenics prior to this. Uh,
Right.
this
Yeah.
is just a straight up, clear-minded conversation talking about some pretty trippy concepts,
Yeah.
if I might add. So, I thought I would start with a couple of quotations from the book, one being, "The infinite is endless. It has no end. This, however, is not like in mathematics, where we suppose an infinite line, a sequence that continues forever in either direction, but that is bounded to a narrow domain. It is actually more appropriate to say that the infinite is unbounded. There are and cannot be borders or bounds to its domain. Its domain is simply all. A definition requires the making finite, the defining of boundaries, so these can be drawn to light in the description. So the infinite cannot be defined because to border it would be to miss it, to not indicate it." And I'll add one more here. "We can know that when we talk about the infinite, we are talking about that which exists beyond all boundaries and is without end. This conception does not and cannot, by definition, give us an accurate picture to hold in our minds about the infinite, but it does give us an understanding of the nature of the infinite, the necessary qualifications it would need to uphold in order to be evidenced." Um, could you please start off by describing your perception of the infinite and what you're talking
Um,
about here?
well, I'll start with the going back to the chapter title, and the chapter title is "The Myth of the Finite," and it's in this first section of the book, which is bad mythologies, things that we believe that we shouldn't believe, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Um, and so this chapter is talking about whether we think of life, existence, fundamental reality, whatever word you might want to use for it, as infinite or finite. And the prevailing view, whether conscious or not, I think, is to view life, existence as finite.
Mhm.
And the infinite's just kind of like a weird thing that mathematicians play with, or people think about it the way that's way out there on the outside of space, or whatever that might be. So I think that first one you pulled out is a good one because it's aimed at pushing us further in what we think about the infinite. Because a lot of times people's only exposure to the concept of infinity, well, even there, you're once you've made it the concept of infinity, you've separated it and put it as a delineated thing in a specific place. But the issue with normal conceptions of the infinite is like an infinite line. Like just imagine a line on a paper going, and it just goes on forever. And you say it's infinite. You say it's infinite. So that's mathematically useful, but it's nothing relevant to, or it's hardly relevant to the actual infinity. And the issue is, okay, yes, it goes on forever, whatever that means, or it goes on to infinity, but it's still, like I said, a narrow domain. A line is one point extended. So the real bounds of infinity, you'd have to take that line and expand it not just to the whole page, but around the whole world and the universe and then through time. And so it really has nothing to do with a line or a set of constituents. We think of infinite numbers or, um, you could get wacky and be like infinite ice cream or whatever it is. But anytime you have a category attached to it, that category is actually limiting. So infinity not only involves numbers and quantities and distances, but it also involves grass, and we'll probably get into this later, but the smell of grass, the perception of grass, um, and conversations and telephone poles and dogs, and there's nothing is outside the bounds of something that is truly infinite. And so that's one step in the process of starting to talk about infinity and wondering whether we're dealing with infinite existence or whether things are, as most people they probably seem, things are finite. Like, look, there's a book over there that's finite. This conversation's going to be finite. We have the habit of thinking of things as finite, but this chapter is about questioning, is that habit reflective of basic reality? And by basic, I mean fundamental, essential, foundational, or is it just a habit? And so it's bringing up that question and trying to get into that issue.
And do you think like that's the real crux of the matter is like the difficulty in trying to explain the infinite in finite terms? Uh, do you think that
That's
that's
definitely part of it. The linguistic issue, like you read additionally quotes there where I'm addressing, making the argument in the favor of the infinite,
Mhm.
and there's an inherent issue in there. I don't think it's a flaw, but it is a difficulty where when I say book, you know what I mean.
Right.
But when I say infinity, there's not an encapsulated thing that you can think about.
Right. It's almost like
So,
you have to, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
It's almost like you have to take, in order to properly define something like a book, you have to have that objective perspective, that view outside, to where you
Yes.
tangibly touch it. But in the proper description of the infinite, it's all encompassing, and I believe that you call it it's all saturating. And so
Yes.
it's hard to really get that objective view on something that is permeating everything and all possibilities of everything.
Yeah, you actually cannot get an objective view of it by definition. And that again is a difficulty because in the realm of science, we take objectivity as sort of the golden standard for rigorously tested and I was about to say objectively existing, but you see my point. And there's an argument in the book that addresses that because when we're looking at objectivity, it's appropriate, uh, but again, it's for things that you can see objectively. The issue is, what if there's a thing that actually exists, but by its very nature, you can only observe it subjectively? And already that sounds wishy-washy to scientists, or people of scientific mindsets. Uh, and it's hard to get around. I'm sensitive to that difficulty. I don't want it to come across as such. I'd certainly define it differently if I could, because it would make it easier. But the nature of infinity is such that you cannot step outside it. If you stepped outside it, you wouldn't be outside it. You Because it would still be going on. So you'd be looking at something that was not actually infinity itself in that sense. So that poses a problem if we believe that only things that are strictly objective are real. But there's a case that I make in this book and actually in my first book as well, Jnana Yoga, um, that in this case, objectivity is not a necessary standard. Um, and that doesn't make it less rigorous. It's a little bit of a technical case, but to state it somewhat simply and hopefully do it some justice is that um, in if infinity exists, then how would I say this? Uh, well, it's a little bit off of this first chapter because I think it's mainly in my first book. But if if we want to put it this way, different, slightly different terms, but same point. If we're trying to test whether existence exists, right? We actually don't need an objective existing thing. Like we can't. Oh, there's a book over there. Okay, I mean you can get into the what if simulation, what if whatever, but it doesn't matter for determining whether or not existence exists. If there is any existence at all, then existence exists, even if that existence is subjective or wholly subjective, not objective at all. There's still existence. So the same type of argument applies to the infinite, but it's a little bit harder to say linguistically. But because of the properties of the infinite, just like you were saying about the self-saturating nature, that the infinite is fully saturated in itself, each part is equally infinite to the whole. Um, that means that infinity is you can't step outside it and look back at it, but it's right there in your face.
Right. It's like you're looking at a tree and somebody's attempting to describe that you're in a forest, but you can't really there's no way to tell that you're in a forest by just seeing a tree. You just know the ability, the potentiality of you being in a forest is there, considering there's a tree in front of you, but you can't really see the forest because you don't have that 35,000 foot view to really tell that. It's there. You're in the forest, you're a part of the forest, but
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes, I think that that's true. And in that case, sort of the tree in our face is our habitual conceptions and frankly, I mean, more or less self-evident experience. There are so many things as far as our experience go that at least to us very much seem finite. So the infinite seems something completely different, far away, odd conceptually. Um, but the way I'd say that analogy doesn't hold as much is that again, my claim in the book is, and this is the only way we can really hope for making a claim that can be substantiated, is that the infinite is right there in your face as that tree, even though what we have in our face we tend to think of as finite. We're actually confronted with infinity itself at all times. So there's a little bit of a uh, foreground background dualism that or that overlaps and interchanges. So it is definitely difficult to
it's hard to properly define. It's and
yeah, you can't define it. Yeah.
I do want to touch on that because you do make a point of um describing. I believe that you bring up the Mandelbrot, and I do want to touch on that at some point
Yeah, sure.
discussion, and also the fact that there's mostly empty space, right? Like we have like we're built up like we are matter,
Yeah.
but if you go in, if you delve further in at a microscopic level and you keep going down, you find mostly empty space between the atoms and electrons and protons. And so what then is the definition of matter if when you get to a specific perspective, there is just space?
Right.
And I do want to touch on that. First, let's peel back if we can to the big to towards the beginning of the chapter where you discuss I believe you touch on this as well as in the introduction, dogmas. Why do you think it's so difficult for people to harbor the idea that there is infinity, that we are in the infinite? Why do you think that people are so driven to holding and maintaining a finite way of thinking?
Well, I think that does tie right into the discussion, and sheds light on what we're talking about because I'm going to draw from Jordan Peterson as well, where he talks about our neurology, our system of perception, basically artificially limits the inputs that we're getting from sensory stimuli and then projects a essentially simulation, a memory and a summary of what's out there. So in a way, it's built into us, and you can see it through necessity of like, if you are unable to distinguish things, then that poses a lot of issues. If I can't say where the book in front of me ends, how can I write on it? Right? Because then I'll just keep going off the page. So we have to be able to process delineations, and delineations are making things finite. And again, even our perception itself, before we consciously do anything, our perception limits things automatically for us. Um, and I think that is maybe well, it's at least analogous to dogma in general, because dogma is like your habitual perception. Your habitual perception limits the amount of input and just gives you a broad brush summary of what's in front of you, as something that you can handle.
And that's based off of your own beliefs and perceptions that you've accumulated through the past. So if you've been held to believe, if you've been holding the belief that life is finite, that there are boundaries, that and then somebody comes around and tries to contradict that, you're less likely to harbor that belief system or to just accept that there's going to be questioning, there's going to be kind of a pushback with that, just like the belief that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, and in fact it's the opposite. You have to
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. You're a bit ahead of me there. I was just gonna
oh,
say how, um when we hear the word dogma, we're trained to think like, religious inquisition and closed-mindedness, but the it's also the case that they're just simply, if let's say it this way, if there is infinite information out there, you can't handle it all,
right.
especially not all at once. And so you can think of a dogma in that way as a cursory summary belief that's um, close enough, or at least that's how I think it probably starts, giving it the best benefit of the doubt that it's not just an aberration, um, that everybody should just get rid of their dogmas and the world would be better. Like, no, we kind of need, not everybody's going to know everything about everything, right? So you're going to have shorthand, low resolution views of things, to use more Jordan Peterson terminology. The issue is when we get to what we think of dogma in a negative sense is when, I think your identity becomes connected to your dogmas. and then you have much more invest in the dogmas, and you don't want the process of having them questioned becomes threatening and painful, not just maybe at most overwhelming and inconvenient. So I think that's where the sharp negative side of dogma comes in, is when we have the natural um, limitation that is not necessarily bad, but then when we get our identity mixed up in it, then that causes issues.
Okay. Um, Now I don't know if you want to save this for a little later in the book, but in the introduction, you touched on how this book was written for those that are further in the pits of despair rather than those that are ready to take on the mantle of responsibility. Um, can you answer or could you touch on possibly now what if one were to accept the infinite rather than the finite, how would they be able to incorporate that within their lives for the better? How would that have a personal effect on one's character and outlook on life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, just to say briefly, because I hope that'll be sort of elucidated as we go, and we're going to hopefully walk everyone along to that point. But I think one thing that has come up for me is a challenging question now of when I'm thinking about something and maybe I'm ready to dismiss it. Um, and then there's a question that comes to my mind. Do you doubt the infinite? Or why do you doubt the infinite? And that gives me some pause. Now, that could obviously be um, misused because, if you just apply that to everything, then you can't disbelieve anything. And obviously, some things need to be vetted and discarded at some point. But so it doesn't need to be an overwhelming, all-encompassing attitude, but just a little bit more of a hopefully curiosity and openness, and more of a view of life has some really interesting things to offer, and there's sort of a constant possibility and mm, well, connection as well. So in a way it's subtle, in a way it's not subtle, but I think this also ties into the what I would say is the appropriate use of skepticism. I think this is something I talked in detail about in my first book. I touch on it a little bit here as well. That a lot of people use the term skepticism to basically mean I believe all the standard things that sciencey people supposedly believe, and I reject anything that sounds wacky from that point of view. But I don't think that's not skepticism. That's just holding the standard dogma.
Mm.
Real skepticism, you have to apply as best you can and serious level of skepticism, both at the things that you habitually accept and at the new things that come in, right? So what that does is, I would put it this way to illustrate it. I think a true skeptic would be more ready to believe in the existence of aliens, or let's say the possibility of the existence of um, whatever currently interacting aliens, and more suspicious about the permanent constant of the law of gravity or something like that. Like, and that sounds weird, but a true skeptic, again, wouldn't settle for, oh, I'm just excited at the possibility of aliens and someone has a picture online and therefore they exist. Like, no, you still apply discernment, but you don't have this view of what amounts to, well, I already know everything that's worth knowing, and I already can predict what the rest of the world looks like. So I'm going to be super skeptical against things that sound outlandish to me, and basically give a pass anything that I feel like I could predict myself. That's fr frankly just arrogance. But I think it's how a lot of us,
Yeah.
even though we may be scientific minded, tend to operate. And the more you can be conscious of that, the better you can, like, maybe that's not, that wild thing. At least someone should be looking into it, even if it's not me. Again, you can't do everything, you can't know everything, but um, why doubt the infinite?
Right.
If you're dealing with infinite possibility around you, that means there can be some wacky stuff going on, near and far. And then additionally, as I said at the beginning, it means that um, your life's more interesting than you think it is.
I think that kind of ties into the idea of freedom, even, of just of boundless potential, as opposed to having a specific set or a specific framework designed and designated to you, uh, that you have to act within those bumpers and those parameters. And so you might be stuck in something that's completely unfulfilling. And so the idea of the finite can be, in my the way I see it, is it's almost constrictive. It's almost, it goes against the idea that, you might be somewhere that you don't want to be right now, but you
Hmm.
tap into it. You can completely change your mindset and become
Right.
whatever it is that you want to be. I mean, sure, you might not at this point. Let's say, you're in your 30s, you're in your late 20s, wherever you are, you're not a young one anymore. You might not be able to become an NBA player. You might not be able to become a Formula One driver. So there are some. Well, then again, who knows? That would make a great movie, right? Uh,
Right.
so I think that the idea of the infinite opens the door and provides a gateway into an unlimited amount of possibilities that you could fulfill. It's boundless potential. You can have, it's like, you let's say you're in a communist socialist society, and so you've been given the job as factory worker. Well, then that's what you are. I mean, regardless of how much you want to become a a sports star, or you want to completely do a 180 on your career, you don't have the choice to do that. But
Right.
in the United States, for example, you have the ability to completely change your career on a whim. Some people don't like that level of choice. I mean, I know some people like myself that would stare in front of the ice cream selection at a grocery store for an hour trying to figure out which flavor, and so you have so
Yeah.
many options that it just kind of paralyzes you.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's a crazy amount of options. And so if you can
Right.
somehow focus that onto something, and you have the ability to do that. And I think that's where my mind goes when I think of the infinite and the endless possibilities. I do want to touch on, if we may, fallibility, because I
Yeah.
think that really ties in to
Yeah. What we were just saying is a good transition. Yeah.
excellent. Thank you. So let's go ahead. The definition of fallibility is actually found in the key terms and concepts. Uh, fallibilism, uh,
Fallibilism.
fallibilism.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, So it's the continual seeking for better explanations and the willingness to notice, admit, and adjust for errors. So again, my idea is, you can't really change 2 + 2 = 4. That's set in stone. But for theories, especially tied around things like metaphysics and even science, things that you are always finding new discoveries. There always seems to be a pushback, right? As soon as something we might be on the cusp of a specific discovery and there begins to be some tangible evidence, there's always the old guard that pushes back against that and says, "No, this is, what we
Right.
came up with is the correct thing." But
Right.
this allows the ability for people to at least have an open enough mind to see new possibilities. And it allows for critical thinking. And I'll just end my point with this, especially in today's society where, you know, everyone's on social media platforms in a completely polarized, there's nobody in the middle anymore. It seems like everybody's on a a complete one end of the pendulum. And so if you try to bring up a point to somebody that's on
Yeah.
the, they're just flat out going to completely disagree with you. And the idea of fallibilism implies that you're open, even if there's evidence supporting something that's on the other end of the spectrum. You're at least open to entertaining that, and that's in my opinion, and that's how real progress is made, is because
Yeah.
you're open.
Yeah, exactly. I think again that's at least a key ingredient in that true skepticism that I was talking about.
Yes.
Um, and so that actually ties right in. I made a blog post and ended up including it in my most recent book called A Political Mantra. And basically, it was a set of beliefs that I think we all more or less intuitively hold and that we can still come together on even in the polarizing times. And I think number whatever 4 on the list was um, uh, fallibility is certain or something like that. And my proof for it was, does anybody want to claim that they are infallible?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a real question. Like, you can try to define fallibility as much as you want, but like, do you think you're infallible? Okay, so that's foul. Like, you're fallible. That's what it is. It means you're not perfect. You don't understand everything, and even the stuff. The key to understand there, I guess, the nuance to it that might be easily overlooked is that what that really means is that even the stuff that you're certain of, in truth, that certainty isn't 100%. Even the 2 + 2 stuff, that's why Descartes, when he did his meditations, created the maybe we're in a dream uh, part of his argument because he claimed that that was the way to get around what they called analytical, well, I don't think analytical truths, so things like 2 + 2 = 4. He said, well, maybe if there was a dream thing going on, you could dream that 2 + 2 = 4 and really believe it, but then wake up and realize that it's totally wrong. And so that could be going on now. We could think 100% yes, 2 + 2 = 4, but then we could wake up and see that's not at least the full story or something like that. So
That'd be a trip.
it kind of basically you can't get to 100% certainty on anything. Well, actually, you can get to 100% certainty on one thing. And if you want to know what that is, you can read my first book, Jnana Yoga, because there's one thing well, no, I won't do that. The one thing you can be certain of is that existence exists. So there you go. But anything other than that is not 100% certain. And so fallibility is just the truth reflecting that I don't know everything, and even the things I do know aren't 100% certain, and then trying to act that out. And then that ties into what we were talking about before, which again is in a way related to the infinite. There's infinite information out there. You can't know everything. You can't be on a path to discovering everything. Other people are going to know things you don't. And this is a point that a bunch of modern thinkers are making that I think is very valuable. Jonathan Haidt is a loud one, and he's done it well. Deutsch did it earlier and very thoroughly. But we do not, we don't think well as individuals. We think
Yeah.
pretty well as groups of people. And this is that, so that's something that Jonathan Haidt would say, although he kind of gets into the qualifying it little bit, but Deutsch is very thorough. Um, we think well when we are in groups that are structured to do two things. One, to creatively conjecture, and two, to collectively criticize.
Yes.
And this is very interesting and a very good insight in that the first step, even in complete hard science, is imagination, is creative conjecture. You are guessing. And when I say conjecture, when I say guessing, that is not a uh, pejorative. It is not like there's something else you should be doing. That is the process of discovery and invention and insight. It is guesswork is not exactly the best word for it, but conjecture. It is supposing, imagining. Then, and so that's important because it opens up the door of like, hey, you can't just dismiss an idea because it's a wacky imagination. That's what all new ideas are all the time.
Yes.
So that's an important first piece. And then the second piece is collective criticism, where you put your new ideas through the ringer of other people. And that doesn't mean, you know, if 90% of the people just bash your idea that you got to throw it away. Like they have to actually criticize it well. There are rules for criticism and what counts and what doesn't. So that's all tied into that community of criticism. So really, Deutsch is describing the scientific community as it actually functions when it does function well. But up until, at least as far as I know, up until his work, pretty much everyone viewed science as disconnected from imagination and what would we say? Um, very sterile and a clean process and dogma free, and neither of those are true. So so fallibility is the keystone on which all of that is built because science is functions on skepticism and the willingness to doubt things and the willingness to question things and the curiosity to suppose different things. So yeah, it's all nicely connected there.
So I do want to add on that, for instance, in the dark days of 2019, um, 2020, 2021, 2022, you had a plethora of experts talk about one thing in particular, saying that it was the way to go and that you couldn't have a discussion about it. You couldn't debate about it, despite evidence showing the contrary. And so I think that that's a really good example of people hiding behind their quote unquote expert titles, and that kind of being, like we are the science, we are the bastion of information. Uh,
Yeah,
and that caused a big problem because you couldn't, and that to me that proved that there was something extremely fishy about the whole situation because you couldn't question it, because you couldn't
right, right.
tinker with the idea of it. You couldn't, it was this way or the highway, and anybody that thought differently, that didn't agree with the quote unquote experts, that, oh, you're taking horse medicine, or that, oh, you can't go paddleboard out on the beach because it's you're going to get sick. Um, in and of itself, it was preposterous, but people bought it hook, line, and sinker because experts were saying it. So that's a big issue too, is maintaining that open discussion within groups of people. And like you said, that's typically where the truth is because it
Well,
resonates.
yeah, and recognizing that that is science.
That is science.
Science is creative conjecture and collective criticism. So if
Exactly.
they're not doing that, they're not doing science. And Deutsch would be a fantastic source for elucidating that. I mean, he had the bestseller in 2011, but I didn't hear about his book until 2016 or 2017, and I've never met anyone who's read it. But I mean, it's just a slam dunk on the case. The
What was
the
that book called again?
the beginning of infinity
Beginning of
by
Infinity.
David Deutsch. Um, the his main thesis and his philosophy of science there is that the unit of operation, you might say, the source of science is explanations.
Mm,
Giving a cogent explanation that can be put to criticism and tested, ideally, is science.
yeah.
Explanations are the opposite of appealing to authority. So when someone tells you something and you say why, self-explanatory. If someone tells you something, say, um, you can't walk your dog between whatever the hours were, 12 a.m. and or 8 a.m. and 12, right? Why? Well, because we said so.
Yeah.
That's appeal to authority. Everybody knows that's bogus. That's an answer you give a 2-year old.
Right.
Right? The answer we're looking for, the answer we're expecting that we all intuitively know is the appropriate answer is for them to say, well, it's because in those hours, uh, and to give you an explanation. And if the explanation makes sense, then okay, you're being transparent, you're being forthright, you're dealing with the problem as you should, you're considering ins and outs, this and that. I can tell that you're doing that because you allowed me to examine your explanation. So yeah, Deutsch is a great source on that, and I think he should get a lot more attention nowadays because of stuff like that. I mean, in addition to just being awesome on all fronts of he really wrote a tour de force in what he was going for. So
On the list.
so I mean, you got to deal with explanations. You don't deal with just
You have to.
authority saying this is how it is, because when someone says this is how it is, your question is why, because you want an explanation. Because we intuitively know
Right.
explanations, that's the money, that's where things happen.
And I think, see, they knew, and I'll say this for, for anybody, whether it's scientists that hide behind the label of expert, it's like they know that when they provide a reason behind the why, it's so bogus that people aren't going to buy it in the first place. So they just hide behind the fact that, okay, we're the experts. We say that this is the way it is because the way this is the way it is. And there's no way you can
Right.
question. Because if
Well,
you do provide
right.
a reasonable, explanation as to why they're doing what they're doing, you can already pick out that it's bogus. So
Right.
it's a lose-lose for them. Them
Right.
not providing a reason brings up suspicion. But then if they were to put out a reason as to why, some bogus reason why, that would even generate suspicion in and of itself because the answer is just complete malarkey.
Yeah. No, there's no malarkey. We're supposed to have in 4 years of no malarkey, right?
Yeah, yeah. 4 years and no
I was
more.
promised that, so that's what
I
I
was
assume is
promised that
happening.
too, man.
Uh,
We were sold a bag of potatoes, you know? But
um, but just on that note, um, that's the thing about explanations is once you put an explanation out there, it's open for criticism.
Right.
You can't offer an explanation that's uncriticizable. So, in a way, you're kind of forced to deal in the truth or look fishy, right? Because either, I mean, it might be what you think is the truth, and then you get it's not, and so you have to adjust what you're doing. That's fine. But when you try to fake an explanation, just like you're saying, well, when you offer an explanation, people criticize it and see if it holds up. And if it's not real, it doesn't hold up. So yeah, but it's like, you know, if you're going to go out and play football, you should put on your pads. You expect what's going to happen. Um, and so if you're going to offer an explanation, you expect it to be criticized. And so you try to make it as best you can and as truthful as you can. And only in the case where, for whatever reason, you're not going to deal in truth or uh, accept criticism, then you would put out a um, explanation like, oh no, it wasn't the obvious correlation of a place that's manufacturing the exact kind of virus that showed up. It's actually the super crazy coincidence that it happened to be this novel virus that happened to start in a wet market that was right next to the place where they were designing those things, but those are not connected whatsoever. No, let's go to the most bizarre coincidence first rather than go to the obvious explanation. Yeah, obviously that's bogus. So,
Derived from an animal that isn't typically sold in wet food markets, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
So, yeah. So
bonkers.
that's the good thing from our point of view about explanations is that they give you understanding and they are criticizable and they are testable and they compete and move us closer to the truth. And then obviously the bad thing about it from the perspective of someone who wants to use authority and skip collective criticism and actual truth seeking consensus, you are forced into a corner if you're going to deal with explanations. And then if you elect not to, it's pretty clear that you're not giving an explanation, and that's a problem.
Exactly. And I'll make one additional point on that before we move on to something incredibly trippy, and that would be it's a Mandelbrot. Mandelbrot, right? I don't know. It's
Close
something
enough.
close enough. And that's, I would expect that level of acceptance to authority, maybe, and I mean, you could even think about this in Hitler's Germany, how were so many people privy to accepting that way of thinking? It's like, you would maybe expect that back when information wasn't so abundant. But I mean, you had people, actually incredibly intelligent people that had a good amount of evidence that were being heard that were contradicting the quote unquote experts, but people were still so focused on listening to that level of authority that it was
Right.
almost it was like it was just it was screw with your mind because it's like, well, I know this guy is a reasonable human being and that he typically engages in critical thinking, and I know that they, in situations past they did have the ability to question certain topics, but why now are they deciding to go full bore into this like submissive, oh, I'm following authority mentality, and I'm going to parrot whatever CNN, MSNBC, ABC talks about. It was a wild time, and
Yeah.
it's an alarming wake up call that people are and are so polarized in that, like, well, this specific party, this group of people thinks this way, and because they do, I'm just going to continue to adhere to that level of thinking without formulating my own opinion by looking at the actual evidence of what's going on and raising questions, even if it's in the minority of beliefs.
Yeah.
And luckily now, I think now things have opened up a little more and people are able to
Yeah.
question these things.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was a little hairy for a it was a little hairy for a second there.
Yeah.
So it was pretty wild. Okay, so let's talk about the Mandelbrot, the Mandelbrot, okay? And
Mhm.
that is, if I'm not mistaken, you can pull these videos up on YouTube, and it's like a continuous pressing forward or diving into an image that unfolds itself in front of you. And so you think you're about to get to the end of it,
Mhm.
the end of that pattern, but that pattern just opens up into another pattern. So, I mean, you could literally
Mhm.
watch this thing
Mhm.
for infinity,
Yeah.
and that's almost a visual representation of infinity. And I'll akin it to the idea that, we think that there's a boundary to the universe, or we think that quarks or wherever we are at this point
Right.
is the smallest thing that we can see, and therefore because it's the smallest we can see, we can observe, the largest we could observe, that's the end of it. But honestly, it seems like that is just, even in observable reality, is infinite. You can always go smaller and you can always go larger.
Mhm.
Could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll say just on the end there, the current, uh, as far as I know, singular hypothesis that would contradict that would be the supposed Planck limit, or I guess it's Planck limit, if we're being vaguely German. But I do address that argument in the book for those who are aware of that and are curious about how it applies. But as of yet, it's completely theoretical, so we can't put too much weight on it. And as you said, from what we've seen, and this is the argument I make in the book, you can't. We have found that what we think is a limit, we always get past. So, yes, the Mandelbrot sets is a mathematical mm, equation and subsequent graph that they get for it. I myself am not a mathematician, so those of you who are curious in that way and don't already know about it, I'm sure there's better sources online. You can just watch the videos; they're awesome, but you can also find people explaining them. And to my best understanding, which is fallible and always fallible, but in this case, not extremely well informed, the equation that we're talking about is a fractal equation, or an equation that produces a fractal pattern, which is a self-similar pattern, which gives it all those cool styles and means that as you zoom in and you go past all these crazy structures, you get back to something that looks like what you started with. And that has all sorts of symbolism and interesting connections to it. But basically, what the image you're looking at in those videos is the plotted points on a graph that have been plugged into this equation, and then they've been color coded based on their different behavior. So it's a bit technical, but it's basically a fancy graph. And because the equation has so much complexity, uh, you're able to zoom in to all these different points on the graph, and each different point has a slightly different variation. And they put in the colors there to sort of just illustrate a little bit more of the detail. So that's how, someone might wonder, like, how is this a math equation and a piece of art at the same time? Well, the colors are input based on certain mathematical qualifications. So again, someone else could explain it in more technical detail. But what you get is this uh, apparently infinite zoom. And the only reason why it's apparently infinite is because in order for it to actually be infinite, you would have to do infinite calculation to form the graph. So people have for a while, I guess for several years, entered into a competition to make a longer one where you zoom in more, but it just takes so much data processing and input that someone's not going to actually. There's not an infinite zoom that you can watch, but in theory, the equation produces an infinite set, so it could continue on forever. But it's a great visual. It's a great thing to look up, and it sort of starts to get you into this mindset of how particular structures, including what look like boundaries can appear within an infinite landscape and give you the appearance of all this steady form and steady um, structure and relationship and again boundaries between things, but how you can always go in and pierce those and see a whole new blossoming of structures and boundaries and whatnot. So um,
The
it's
bound
really it's really a good it's a good visual for what we're talking about.
boundless boundaries. You can just continue to go down. So that's spelled Mandelbrot.
Yes.
Mandelbrot. Uh,
Mhm.
so that would be the image of it right there.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's the self-similar structure. And that connects to the self-saturating quality of the infinite that I talk about a bit in this chapter, that there's this um, similar, or in the infinite's case, infinitely uh, similar presence throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that that ties in very well with the discussion. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit. At the very beginning, you had mentioned like the linear mathematical set of numbers. Uh,
Mhm.
how those can go. I mean, you can start with whatever number you want,
Mhm.
continue to add essentially to infinity. I mean, there you can always add an additional number. I'll go ahead and bring up that diagram that you have in the book here. There we go, page 53. And if you can talk a little bit about this, because this is fascinating. So we
Yep.
have a couple diagrams there. You have diagram one and diagram two. Diagram one is that explanation of starting at a specific number and then just continuing all the way out to infinity. But you are on that linear line. Could you please
Mhm.
go into diagram two, which it looks like you have some arrows pointing down on each number. You go one through six, and then you have arrows pointing down to each number.
Yeah, we hold it up again just while I talk so people can have it for reference. So on the top in our diagram one, we have two sets of numbers, one starting at one starting at two. They both go on to infinity, theoretically, let's say. The point of that is that both of those sets are actually equal in number because they're both infinite, even though one of them's missing a number. And so that's a property that Deutsch brings up is any subset of an infinite set is equal to the whole set. So any part of infinity is equal to all of infinity. And so that's what that diagram is supposed to illustrate. And just gives you that weird little, but wait, there's a number missing, but they're still both infinite. So they're the same. Um, so there's a weirdness to infinity. Now, diagram two is taking that conception and saying what that means is because infinity is there all along, we can't go to this place where we exile infinity to this weird thing that's at the end of a line, or like what comes when you add up a bunch of things, or was what started the line of causation in the universe, but just started it and stayed back there. And then now we're here in the universe with causation. No, actually, infinity has to be present in each moment. So diagram two is used in the text to say, um, while there's an experience that we're having of linear causation and finite one moment to the next, each of those has uh, an infinite reality and constituency and potential in it, and that means it has to be supported and encapsulated. Really, this is all spatial language, so it's hard. It doesn't quite apply, but the infinity has to be present at each moment, not just this weird thing that's at the beginning of a line of causation, like the first cause argument. Oh, it's off there, or way at the end of an infinite line, or a conception of an infinite set of numbers. If we're dealing with infinity, then infinity is here now and always present. So that's what diagram two is supposed to illustrate.
It's wild, man. I think that's a real that's the creme de la creme on on this here. I mean, that's wild stuff. Um, let's talk about a little bit going into that towards the end of the chapter, you describe boundaries. I think it was actually before that. Um, the idea of you, okay, so here we go. Page 49. You have existence and you don't have non-existence because it is not something to have, it does not exist. So you merely have existence. But what is an existence which is only bounded by that which does not exist? It is necessarily infinite. So it's like it's hard to perceive something that does not exist. You naturally are inclined to think that, well, if there's a specific boundary, and you touch on this as well, what is that boundary made out of? What is holding, why is there a boundary? Is there something outside of that boundary that
Yes, exactly.
is preventing from coming in? And is that so how can you properly describe uh the boundaries that people try to propose that keeps existence away from non-existence?
Right. Yeah. So this is the key point of the chapter of showing that an a finite fundamental existence, a finite basic reality is nonsensical. It doesn't exist. In reality itself or life itself, existence itself has to be infinite. And again, that's something foreign to us because we're so used to seeing boundaries. But what we often forget is there's always an outside to a boundary. So each one of these books on the shelf here has a boundary. Each shelf is itself a boundary. The whole thing itself has a boundary. But the thing is, each one of those boundaries has an outside, and the outside is made of something and then continues on into something else. So if we're talking about fundamental, basic, core existence or reality or whatever you want to say, what would it look like for that to be a finite thing, for that to have an end? What would be beyond the end of existence? Well, there's really only one option. It would have to be non-existence because anything that exists is existence, right? It's a piece of existence. So you can't have a space of existence and then a piece of existence outside to verify that it ended. That gets back to the objective, subjective thing. Okay. But let's suppose, well, we're not going to get outside and look at it. Fair enough. But we can still suppose that it exists, right? We're just supposing, we're conjecturing. So if there's an end, a boundary to existence, well, the only thing that could be is non-existence. Non-existence would have to be the boundary of existence. And you let in right there at the crux of it, where it's we when we're talking about this almost seems rational because we'll say, well, there's existence and then there's non-existence. But you can't say that because now you've said there's two things next to each other. No, no, no. There's existence and there's not non-existence. So there's only existence. And if the boundaries of existence only exist in the non-existent, that means they don't exist. So there's only an unbounded existence, and that means existence is infinite. So um, so the boundaries thing is really interesting because just like in the Mandelbrot, just like in this bookshelf here, we're so habitually used to boundaries and they just seem so obvious to us. It seems weird to say something doesn't have a boundary or something can't have a boundary. What does that mean? But when you look into the nature of the thing itself and you're looking at fundamental existence, actually it's the opposite. Actually, there's no way to suppose a bounded fundamental existence. Because again, then you're bounding it with non-existence, which doesn't exist, so the boundaries don't exist, so therefore it's infinite.
I think that's perfectly well said. That was very well
Thank
said.
you.
Yeah, that's I mean, it's hard to refute that, because we do think in finite boundaries. It's almost like For some reason, I have the idea of like there's the analogy of three blind men um,
Right.
feeling an elephant, right? They're feeling an elephant, and each has a description of what the elephant is, and they're trying to properly, they each have a different example, a different opinion, and it's almost the same thing in my as I see it, where you know we try to conceptualize what the boundary is of what that is when in actuality it's none of that. There is no boundary. It's all there isn't non-existence.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I think just to add a little bit on there, it's helpful to realize the mistake that we're making when we have that. We say, well, we have existence and we have non-existence, or when we imagine a boundary to fundamental existence. When we're imagining that boundary, we're whether we know or not, we're putting ourselves outside the boundary so we can see it from outside. But then we've hypothesized something existing outside of the boundary in order to see it from outside. So we actually haven't hypothesized or conjectured, you might say, we haven't conjectured a finite existence that we're seeing from the outside. We've actually conjectured a bounded space inside a greater existing area where there's an observer out here. So that's just a tool to help you track if you think that you've pictured an infinite space, or sorry, a finite space, a finite fundamental space, finite fundamental reality, check and see if you've put yourself outside it,
Yeah.
right? In your imagination. If you're imagining the outside of a boundary or something beyond a boundary, you're not imagining fundamental existence being bounded by non-existence because you're imagining basically a light space and a dark space, but the dark space is still taking up space, so it actually exists. So anyhow,
So because yeah. So that brings me to my next question that I'm itching to ask you, but and that has to do with the perspective of infinite consciousness. But I do think that that is in the next chapter. At
yeah.
the
So I would say, just as a tease, that's we have that intuition. I think that intuition reflects something of when we're trying to imagine a finite existence, we pull ourselves out of it because something in us has that natural reflex of, I'm not in there. I'm
Yeah,
not in the finite.
right.
So that's a teaser. But yes, it is in the next chapter, and we'll get to that next time. But go ahead.
I'll go ahead and read the page 59. You have a quotation regarding that. In reality, the infinity of existence is the same thing as the infinity of consciousness, and very direct and important conclusions follow. So that's going to be a topic of discussion in the second chapter, which is the myth of materialism.
Hmm.
While the chapter we just went through was titled The Myth of the Finite. Uh,
Hmm.
and to close this out, there is a really good quotation on page 29 by Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, and that is, it is our responsibility to see what is before our eyes courageously and to learn from it, even if it seems horrible. And I think that that's excellent because
I can
oh, what
hear
happened?
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yep,
What happened? Can you see me?
I can see you.
Can? Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. On my end, it says it can't open the page. Anyway, we'll just move along. Um, so is there anything you'd like to add to that, Rob?
Well, I just say I think that brings us around full circle to um, what we were talking about with curiosity, openness, dogma of we have to be willing to look
Mhm.
and in what we find and we examine the explanations. And even if it is not something we want to find, um, we've got to check it out.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Even if it pushes against the grain and pushes up against boundaries and takes us into areas that are dark and stinky and that we don't really want to dive into,
Right.
A lot of truths, a lot of answers can be found there. And I
Right, which is just to tie back to the last episode briefly, that's the whole um that's the whole selling point of looking into antinatalism or any of the other anti-human things is like, well, if it's true, you should know it. Like, yeah, for sure. I 100% believe that. But if it works for them, it's got to also work in the other direction. Like you got to be open to looking into these things and sorting them out. And you can't just play it one-sided where like, oh, you have to look into my thing, but don't look into that other guy's thing over there.
I think that that's one of the main points of the book is you were willing to actually go in to some of these, I think like Benatar and
Mhm.
and who you would typically, and I would even use a strong word, vehemently disagree with his opinions, but you're able to go into his writings and his works to properly dissect it and discount it rather than just the fact that it's an opposing point of view and leaving it at that. And I think that there's something really powerful to say about that. And not a lot of people are willing to do it. I don't know a lot of people that are willing to listen to the speech of a political opponent to properly listen to what they're saying and dissect that and point out the flaws
Right.
in speech. So
Right. Well, that's the whole point of the first part of the book, which is the first five chapters. Each one is about looking into the opposing case and giving it a full run and a fully fleshed out explanation and testing it and saying, what actually stands up here. So there's more of that to come.
more of that to come. Episode 3 coming short.
Yes.
All right, next week we'll have episode 3 up. Rob, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close this bad boy out?
No, I think that covers it.
Yeah, excellent discussion. All right, Rob. Well, I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Everybody, we will go ahead and leave a link for the book, which is available on Amazon. If you just type into the search bar, Purpose and Form, Robert B. Davis, it will pop up, or you just give that little click on the link down below. If you'd like to add anything to this discussion, please feel free to leave a comment. If you have any questions to ask myself or Rob, we'll go ahead and get to that on the next discussion. Otherwise, God bless and may peace be with you. Have a great night.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Rob. Good night.